My name is Sara, and I was 33 years old the day I married into a family that had already decided how I would disappear. The reception was held in a country club ballroom just outside Asheville, North Carolina. All white roses and old money that wasn't really there anymore. I was fixing my veil in the copper backsplash behind the bar, a mirror I never asked for, and that is the only reason I saw my mother-in-law. Diane stood behind me, and she didn't notice my eyes in the polished metal. She only saw my champagne glass. I watched her slide a small glass vial from her clutch and tip 3 clear drops into my flute. I didn't turn around. I didn't scream. I'd spent 8 years working in an emergency room, and you learn to keep your face completely still while your hands keep moving. I switched our glasses while she smiled at the room. What she did next, after she lifted that glass to her lips, is the part nobody in that ballroom was ready for. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet women have loud reckonings and a whole room can go silent in a single breath. If you've ever been the one they seated at the far table and hoped would stay small, you're going to feel this one. Settle in, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up 3 years, because you need to know who I was before that ballroom. I grew up on a dairy farm in the Shenandoah Valley, the kind with a kitchen that smelled like coffee at 4 in the morning. My father milked 60 cows by hand when the machines broke, and they broke often. When I was 19, the bank sent a letter that nearly took the farm. I remember my mother reading it twice, folding it into a small square, and saying, "Well, we'll figure it out." And we did. I worked 2 jobs and put myself through nursing school at night, sending home every spare dollar until the note was paid. Nobody handed me a thing. I learned to read people the way my father read weather, by the small signs, the tightening around the eyes, the way a hand goes still right before bad news arrives. In the ER, that skill keeps patients alive. You watch the ones who say they're fine. You watch the still ones hardest of all. By 30, I was a charge nurse steady under pressure, the person they called when a room went sideways. What I was not good at was letting anyone carry anything for me. I fixed things. I handled things. I stood between other people and the worst day of their lives, and I told myself that was the same thing as being close to someone. It isn't. That habit would cost me later in a way I didn't expect, but it would also save me. Reading a room is a survival skill, and mine was about to be tested by the most polished, most dangerous patient I'd ever encountered. I met Elliot Hartwell at the hospital, of all places. He had brought his uncle in with chest pain, and he stayed in the waiting room for 9 hours without once asking a nurse to hurry. That patience was what I noticed first. We dated quietly for a year before he took me to meet his mother. The Hartwell estate sat on 40 acres outside Asheville, white columns, a long gravel drive, a portrait of some general nobody could quite place. Margaret met us in the front room with a smile that arrived half a second too late. She asked about my parents, and when I said farmers, she repeated the word as if she were holding it with tongs. "And what exactly do your people do?" she asked, as though cows were a hobby. I told her my father ran a dairy operation. She turned to Elliot and said, "How wholesome." Over dinner, she mentioned the Hartwell name 4 times and the family trust twice. When I stood to help clear the plates, she touched my wrist gently and said the line I would hear in my sleep for years. "You can put a nurse in a white dress," she said, smiling at the room, "but she's still staff." Everyone laughed like it was charming. Elliot didn't. He caught my eye across the table, and underneath it, he reached for my hand. That was the moment I understood 2 things at once. His mother saw me as help that had wandered into the family photo. And the family money she guarded so tightly was not nearly as deep as that house wanted you to believe. I just didn't yet know how far she would go to keep both of those things hidden. 3 years is a long time to be corrected gently. That was Margaret's method, never a blow, always a tap. At Thanksgiving, she seated me at the children's table and called it cozy. At the Hartwell Christmas, she handed everyone a wrapped gift and handed me a gift card, explaining she wasn't sure of my taste. When the family gathered for its portrait by the staircase, Somebody always needed me to hold the dog. I have no photographs of myself from 2 of those holidays. I stopped mentioning it, because mentioning it made me the problem. Meanwhile, I began to see the shape of what she was protecting. The Hartwell estate ran on a family trust, and Elliot's share of it funded more of our life than he liked to admit: the car, part of the apartment in Charlotte, the membership at that country club. Margaret controlled the spigot, and Lawrence Finch, the family attorney, controlled the paperwork. Elliot had grown up being told the trust was the family's spine, and that loyalty to it was loyalty to his father's memory. He wasn't greedy. He was dependent, which is a quieter trap. I kept asking myself the same question, the one that wouldn't sit still. Why would a woman with so much status spend so much energy making a nurse from a dairy farm feel small? Contempt is cheap. Effort costs something. Margaret was spending real effort on diminishing me, and people don't do that out of snobbery alone. They do it out of fear. I should have followed that thread sooner. By the time I did, I was already engaged, and the wedding was already being planned by the one person in that family who frightened me most. Elliot proposed on the back porch of my parents' farm, my father's old barn standing behind him. He chose that spot on purpose, and I loved him for it. I expected Margaret to fight the wedding. She didn't. That should have been my first real warning. Within a week, she had appointed herself the planner: to take the burden off you, dear, you work such long shifts. She booked the country club, chose the flowers, the cake, the seating. I tried to push back once on the guest list, and she pressed my hand and said, "Let me give you this. It's the least the family can do." It was so warm it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have told you exactly why. The one thing she insisted on, the thing she mentioned 3 separate times, was the toast. "I'll handle the champagne," she said. "And I'll say a few words before we lift our glasses. A mother should get to bless her son's marriage." Elliot thought it was sweet. I thought it was strange that a woman who had never once blessed anything I did suddenly wanted to bless the most important day of my life. But I was tired, working 4 12-hour shifts a week, and I let it go. That is the part one keep turning over. I noticed the wrongness. I felt the cold edge underneath the warmth. And I told myself I was being unfair to a woman who was finally trying to be kind. I let her pour the champagne. I let her hold the toast. I walked into my own wedding having already handed the dangerous patient the one tool she'd been asking for. The rehearsal dinner was the night before, in a private room at the club. Margaret had place cards written in calligraphy and a speech she pretended was off the cuff. She had been unervingly kind all evening, refilling glasses, laughing at my father's jokes about cows. Near the end, she stood and tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room hushed for her the way rooms always did. She talked about Elliot as a boy, about legacy, about the Hartwell name, about how family is more than blood, it's loyalty. Then she raised her glass, looked straight at me, and said, "To family. The real kind." Everyone drank and beamed. My mother squeezed my arm, but I watched Margaret's face over the rim of her glass, and her eyes never warmed the way her mouth did. There's a thing that happens to a person's face when they're smiling and lying at the same time, a flatness in the cheeks, a stillness in the eyes that doesn't match the curve of the lips. Nurses learn to recognize it on the worst nights. Margaret had that face. Elliot leaned over and whispered, "See, she's coming around." I nodded, because I wanted it to be true. I wanted, just once, to be wrong about a person. I told myself the line was just her being grand, the real kind. I let it slide off me. I would hear those 4 words again the very next day, in the same voice, with the same flat eyes. The second time, they would land like a verdict. I just didn't yet know she meant them as a sentence, and that she had already decided how to carry it out. The wedding day was bright and too warm, the kind of June afternoon that makes everyone drink faster. The ceremony went off without a scratch. Elliot cried a little when he said his vows, which I'll never tell him I noticed. The reception moved into the ballroom, and the staff lined the long marble bar with champagne flutes for the toast Margaret had insisted on running herself. I slipped behind the corner of that bar to fix my veil, which had come loose during the first dance. Years earlier, I had admired the copper backsplash there, a sheet of hammered metal polished to a soft mirror, and I'd mentioned it to the banquet manager. So I was looking at my own reflection, pinning the veil back into place, when a second figure rose into the copper behind me. Margaret. She was standing at the bar 3 feet away, and she did not know I could see her. She thought my back was turned. She set down 2 flutes, mine marked with a small gold ribbon she had tied herself so the bride doesn't lose hers. Then she opened her clutch. I watched her fingers find a small glass vial, the kind you'd get from a compounding pharmacy, and I watched her thumb the dropper and tip 3 clear drops into the flute with the gold ribbon. My flute. She capped the vial, tucked it away, and adjusted a nearby rose as if nothing had happened. I had maybe 5 seconds before she would turn and look for me. Every alarm I owned went off at once, the same calm red alarm that fires when a patient codes and the room needs one person not to panic. I did not let my face change. I had seen 1,000 bad moments and learned that the first person to move with steady hands controls everything that happens next. So I made my hands steady. I finished pinning my veil. I smiled at my reflection, and I decided in that long, quiet second exactly what I was going to do. I turned around as if I'd just noticed her. "There you are," I said, as warmly as I could manage. "Is it almost time?" Margaret's smile snapped into place, late, as always. "Almost, dear," she said. "Go find Elliot. I'll bring the flutes." She started to usher me toward the floor. Then I touched her arm and said, "Oh, I'm parched. Let me carry them." Before she could refuse, I picked up both flutes, one in each hand, and held them out like an offering. "You do the toast. I'll be your bartender for 10 seconds. She had no graceful way to say no in front of the bartender and 2 passing aunts. I handed her a glass and kept one for myself. And in that half-second of the exchange, with my body between her and the bar, I gave her the one with the gold ribbon. Her own dropper. Her own 3 drops. Now sitting in her hand. She didn't notice. People see what they expect, and she expected the marked glass to be in the bride's hand, exactly where she'd placed it. We walked to the center of the floor together, the dangerous patient and the nurse, both of us smiling for the cameras. Elliot found me looking radiant, completely oblivious. Margaret tapped her glass with a ring, and the ballroom of 200 people went quiet for her the way it always did. She lifted the gold-ribboned flute, found my eyes, and said it again in the same grand voice, with the same flat stare. "To family. The real kind." And then, while 200 people raised their glasses to my marriage, my mother-in-law drank a long swallow of her own champagne. I touched mine to my lips and did not drink. I set it down behind a centerpiece. Then I picked up something far more valuable than wine, slid the marked flute into the little beaded clutch on my wrist, and waited. That is when the real drama began. It took about 40 minutes. We were halfway through dinner when Margaret's words began to blur at the edges. She laughed too long at something the alderman's wife said. She reached for her water and missed the glass by an inch, then laughed at that too. By the time the band started, she was listing in her chair like a sail with no wind. Her daughter, Claire, went pale and hurried over. Lawrence Finch materialized at Margaret's elbow with a frown that didn't quite fit the moment, more worried than confused, the worry of a man whose plan was going wrong. Margaret tried to stand, and her knees turned to water. It took 2 cousins and a waiter to walk her out to the car. The matriarch of the Hartwell family, glassy-eyed and mumbling, hung between 2 men in front of every guest she had ever wanted to impress. The whispers started before the doors even closed. Someone said she must have been nervous and overdone the wine. Someone else said they'd never seen her like that in 40 years. I stood in my wedding dress and watched the woman who had planned my public collapse get folded into the back of a black Mercedes by people she had spent her whole life ranking above herself. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt cold. A clean, clinical cold, because a nurse knows the difference between 3 glasses of wine and a chemical. And I was watching that difference walk right out the door. I still had her flute in the clutch on my wrist. The party went on. Elliot danced with me and worried about his mother out loud. I held him and said nothing, because I didn't yet have the one thing that would let me say anything at all. Proof. I stood there in my veil watching guests murmur behind their hands, and I made a decision I want you to remember. I wasn't going to scream, or accuse, or ruin my own wedding on a feeling. I was going to do what 8 years in an emergency room had trained me to do. Stay calm, secure the evidence, and let the facts speak louder than I ever could. If you've ever trusted that quiet voice in your gut that whispers something here is wrong, you already know what I did next. Stay with me, and subscribe. We spent our wedding night at a hotel near the club, and I lay awake while Elliot slept. The doubts came in waves, the way they do at 3 in the morning. Maybe I had imagined the vial. Maybe it was eye drops, or her heart medication, or some harmless thing, and my exhausted brain had turned ordinary into sinister. I had been awake for 20 hours. I had been disliked by this woman for 3 years. Wasn't it possible I had finally cracked and seen a monster where there was only a snob? I almost talked myself out of it. Then I got up quietly, carried the beaded clutch into the bathroom, and looked at the flute under the light. The gold ribbon. The faint film at the bottom that wine alone does not leave. I am a nurse. I have handled 10,000 specimens. My hands knew what to do before my mind finished arguing. I found a clean hotel laundry bag, slid the flute inside without touching the rim, knotted it, and labeled it in pen with the date, the time, and where it came from, the same way I would label a blood draw I intended to swear to in court. Then I sat down on the cold tile floor in my wedding nightgown and made myself say the truth out loud, just once, so I would stop being afraid of it. If I was wrong, I would quietly throw it away and never tell a soul. I would have lost nothing but a little sleep. If I was right, the woman who had just become my mother by law had tried to drug me at my own wedding, to make me look like a stumbling, incoherent mess in front of everyone who mattered to her. There was only one way to know which it was. And I was not going to ask the family. I was going to ask a lab. On Monday I went back to work, smiled at everyone, and stayed late. A forensic tech named Renata had trained beside me for 6 years, and we had held each other up through 3 bad codes in one night once. That kind of thing builds a different sort of trust. I caught her on her break, off the floor, and told her the truth plainly, because I don't lie to people I respect. I never asked her to run anything. The hospital's own lab was the last place on earth a sample like this belonged. I asked her one thing only: how does a nurse preserve something so that a court will trust it later? Renata didn't flinch. She told me to keep it sealed, touch nothing, and call a lawyer before I did anything else. And she pointed me to an independent forensic toxicology lab that handled chain of custody work for attorneys. Pay out of pocket through their intake channel, she said. Fill out their custody form, ship it yourself, and let no one in this building anywhere near it. If it's nothing, you'll feel silly for a week. If it's something, you'll be glad you didn't hand it to a detective in a sandwich bag. I packed the flute exactly the way she described, filled out the custody form, and shipped it overnight to a forensic toxicology lab in Greenfield. Then came the part I'm worst at. Waiting. For 9 days I went to work, came home to the Charlotte apartment, kissed my new husband, and said nothing about the package that could undo his entire family. I told myself I was protecting him until I was sure. The truth is, I was doing what I always do, carrying the heaviest thing alone, because I didn't know how to set it on the table between us. That habit was about to start tearing at the one good thing I had. On the 5th day, I tried to say it. Elliot had spent 2 evenings worried about Margaret, who had gone home and taken to her bed with what Lawrence called exhaustion. Elliot sat at our kitchen counter that night, turning his coffee mug in slow circles, and said, "I just don't understand it. She's never had more than 2 glasses in her life. It was the opening I had been waiting for. I set down my own mug and said it carefully. Elliot, I don't think it was the wine. He looked up. What do you mean? I told him what I had seen in the copper, the vial, the 3 drops, the gold ribbon, the switch. I kept my voice level, the same voice I used to tell a family their father is not going to make it. He listened to all of it. And then his face closed like a door. You think my mother poisoned you, he said. Not a question. An accusation pointed back at me. I think she drugged the glass meant for me, I said. And I think she drank it by mistake. He stood up so fast the stool scraped. She had too much to drink, Sara. That's all. People don't do what you're describing. My mother is difficult. She is not a criminal. I had expected denial. I hadn't expected it to feel like a slap. I almost told him about the lab. I almost laid the whole thing on the counter, but the look on his face told me he would defend her against a feeling with everything he had. And I had only a feeling, not yet a number on a page. So I did the thing I always do. I closed the door he had closed, and I carried it alone. And I waited for Greenfield. That weekend, the family held a post-wedding brunch at the Hartwell house, because Margaret, feeling much better now, wanted to thank everyone for their grace. I almost didn't go. I went because staying away would have looked like the guilt they wanted to pin on me. The house was full of relatives eating quiche off the good china. Margaret held court from an armchair with a blanket over her knees, playing the recovering grande dame. She thanked the room for understanding her little spell. She did not look at me once. I drifted toward the hallway to find a quieter corner, and that is where I saw them. Claire and Lawrence Finch tucked into the study off the hall, talking low and fast. Claire had her arms crossed tight. Lawrence held a thick manila folder against his chest like a shield. I caught only the tail end of it before they noticed me. Can't wait. The timing matters now. Then Claire saw me in the doorway and the conversation died like a snuffed candle. Myra, Sara, she said, too brightly. We were just discussing some family business. Boring trust paperwork. She steered Lawrence out past me, and the folder went with him. I caught the corner of a printed cover sheet with a date typed across the top. I didn't get the date. I got the feeling. The same cold I'd had at the wedding. Claire drowning in something. Lawrence guarding paper. Margaret performing fragility for an audience. 3 people. 1 folder. And a sentence that ended with the timing matters now. I went back to the brunch and ate quiche I couldn't taste, and I added it to the list forming in my head. Whatever Margaret had tried to do to me, she hadn't done it alone. And they weren't finished. The report came on a Tuesday, 9 days after the wedding, while I was sitting in my truck in the hospital parking garage on a 15-minute break. The lab in Greenfield sent it as a secure PDF. I remember the concrete pillar in front of me, the number 3C stenciled on it in faded yellow, because I stared at that number for a long time after I read the results. The screen named one compound present at a concentration the report flagged in bold. A benzodiazepine. Not eye drops. Not heart medication. A powerful sedative, the kind that drops a grown adult into a slurring, knee-buckling fog within the hour. The kind that, in a woman my size after 2 glasses of champagne, could have put me flat on the ballroom floor in front of 200 people. The report listed the estimated dose. It was not a small one. It was not an amount anyone takes by accident, and it was not anything that belongs in a glass of wine. I read it 3 times. The first time I felt nothing, the clinical blankness that lets you keep working. The second time, my hands started to shake against the steering wheel. The third time, I understood fully what had almost happened to me, and what was meant to happen to me. She hadn't wanted me dead. That was almost worse. She had wanted me ruined. She had wanted Elliot's new wife to crumple and babble in front of every Hartwell who mattered, so that for the rest of my life, I would be the bride who fell apart, the unstable nurse who couldn't hold her drink, the mistake the family could quietly correct. The number on that page was the proof I had been waiting 9 days for. I sat there in Space 3C with a forensic toxicology report on my phone and my entire life rearranged around it. Now I had the what. What I needed next was the why, and how to prove she had meant it. The why arrived 2 days later, and it came from Elliot's own hands. He had gone to the Hartwell house to check on his mother and came home carrying a thick envelope. "Mom asked me to bring these home and look them over," he said, dropping it on the counter. "Some trust thing Lawrence says we should both sign." He went to shower, and I sat with that envelope, and after a while I opened it, because by then I had stopped pretending we were the kind of family where you don't read the paperwork. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a post-nuptial agreement drafted by Lawrence Finch that would have stripped me of any claim to anything Hartwell, any account, any property, any share of the trust, in the event of divorce, or, the document specified, incapacity or conduct rendering the marriage voidable. The second was worse. It was a draft petition for annulment alleging that I had entered the marriage under false pretenses and had displayed erratic and intoxicated behavior suggesting I was unfit. Both documents were dated. I checked the dates twice, then a third time, because I needed to be absolutely sure my eyes weren't doing what I wanted them to. The postnuptial agreement was dated 11 days before the wedding. The annulment petition was dated 9 days before the wedding. They had drafted the papers to dissolve my marriage before I had ever walked down the aisle. The drugging wasn't an impulse. It was the trigger for a plan already sitting in a folder, waiting for me to collapse on cue so they could file it. I heard the shower shut off down the hall, and I knew that the man drying his hair 20 feet away had just carried the proof of his mother's scheme into our home and set it on the counter himself. I didn't ambush him. I made coffee. And when he came out, I asked him to sit down. I laid 3 things on the counter in a row, like instruments on a tray. The toxicology report. The postnuptial agreement. The annulment petition. "Read the dates," I said. "That's all I'm asking. Just read the dates." He read. I watched it happen the way I've watched it happen to 100 families in a hospital, the slow arrival of a truth too large to take in one breath. His face moved from annoyed to confused to something gray and stricken. "This is dated before the wedding," he said quietly. "Both of them." "Yes." He touched the report without picking it up, as if it were hot. "And this is what was in the glass?" "That's what was in the glass meant for me," I said. "Which your mother drank instead, because I switched them." He put both hands flat on the counter and stared at the marble for a long time. I had learned not to fill that silence. "She told me you were unstable," he finally said. "Last week, she said marriage had brought out something in you, that she was worried about your drinking. She asked me to keep an eye on you." His voice cracked on the last word, because he understood now that the script had been written for him too. He had been cast as the loving son who would reluctantly agree his wife was unwell. "Elliot," I said, "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to look at the dates and tell me what you see." He looked up, and his eyes were wet and furious. For the first time, that fury wasn't aimed at me. "I see," he said, "that my mother planned all of this before we were even married. Margaret did not wait quietly while we figured things out. A drowning person grabs whatever is nearest. And what was nearest to her was the family's belief in her." Within the week, the calls started. An aunt phoned Elliot to say she had heard the new wife had been acting strangely, drinking heavily, and was he all right? A cousin texted me directly to say she was there if I ever needed help with anything, in the careful tone people reserve for the struggling members of their family. Margaret had spent 3 years quietly establishing that I was beneath them. Now she spent 2 weeks establishing that I was unstable, working the phones from her armchair, planting the same seed in a dozen ears. She was building the audience that would later nod along when the annulment was filed. The genius of it, and I will grant her this much, the cold genius of it, was that the more upset I became, the more it seemed to prove her point. If I called relatives to defend myself, I was the hysterical bride. If I stayed silent, the story filled the silence on its own. It was a trap with no clean exit, the kind designed by someone who understood that reputation is a courtroom where the accused never gets to speak. For about a day, I let it get to me. I drafted angry texts I didn't send. I rehearsed speeches in the shower. Then I made myself stop. I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and did the thing my father had taught me when the bank letter came. I stopped reacting to the storm and started taking inventory of what I actually had. Because I had realized something. Margaret was fighting the war she was good at. And I was about to make her fight one she wasn't. Here is what I understood at that kitchen table, and what I want you to understand too. Margaret's weapons were rumor, charm, and a chemical in a glass. Things that work in the dark. Things that fall apart the second a light is turned on. My wounded instinct wanted to fight her the way she fought, to call the relatives, to whisper my own version, to win the gossip. That was the trap. You cannot out-rumor a woman who has been building her reputation for 40 years. So I chose different weapons on purpose. The ones I actually had. Documents. A chain of custody. Witnesses. The law. I am a nurse, not a brawler. My entire career is built on writing things down so clearly that no one can argue with them later, on preserving what is true so a doctor 3 shifts from now can trust it. That was the war I knew how to fight. The next morning I did 2 things. I called a lawyer, a precise woman in Charlotte named Joan Albright, who had handled a malpractice case I'd witnessed years earlier and never forgotten. And I called the non-emergency line of the county sheriff's office near Asheville and asked how a person reports a poisoning when she has the toxicology report and the container. They told me to come in. I told Elliot both things that night. No hiding it this time. The report and the lawyer and the sheriff, all of it on the table between us. I'm not going to scream at your family, I said. I'm going to do this in daylight, with paper, the right way. I just need to know if you're standing next to me or across from me when I do. He didn't hesitate. Next to you, he said, and he meant it. Joan Albright was the kind of lawyer who listens for an hour before she says 10 words. I laid everything out on her conference table and she made me walk through it twice while she took notes in tiny, precise handwriting. Then she told me what I had and what I didn't. What I had was strong. A sealed flute with a documented chain of custody. A forensic report naming a sedative at a meaningful dose. A post-nuptial agreement and an annulment petition dated before the wedding, which spoke directly to intent, the hardest thing to prove in a case like this. What I didn't have yet, she said, was the human thread. The witnesses who could place Margaret's hand on that vial in the eyes of a jury or a family. So we built it. The banquet manager remembered Margaret at the bar before the toast, fussing with the flutes herself and saying it was a mother's privilege. The bartender remembered the gold ribbon and remembered me carrying both glasses out. A cousin, the same one who had offered help so carefully, sheepishly admitted that Margaret had called her a week before the wedding to say I had a drinking problem the family would have to manage together. Given that I barely drink, and the wedding hadn't yet happened, that was a time-stamped lie. Joan lined them up like sutures, one after another, each one closing the wound a little tighter. You understand, she said, setting down her pen, that proving she meant to do this is the entire game. Anyone can spike a glass. Spiking a glass with the divorce papers already drafted, that's a plan. Plans have authors. She paused. And your mother-in-law left her authorship all over the paperwork. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The deeper Joan dug into the trust, the more the whole picture came into focus. Margaret hadn't been the only one with a reason to want me gone, and she might not even have been the architect. Claire, it turned out, was drowning. Her event planning company had collapsed 18 months earlier, and she had personally guaranteed nearly $400,000 in loans she couldn't service. She had been quietly pressing her mother for an advance on her trust distribution. And the trust, Joan discovered, was nowhere near as full as the family believed. That was Lawrence's piece. Serving as both trustee and the trust's attorney, an arrangement ripe for self-dealing that no one had ever thought to examine, Lawrence Finch had spent years billing the estate generously and moving assets through entities only he could see clearly. The columns and the country club and Elliot's monthly allowance were a stage set propped up by appearances. A daughter-in-law who hired a lawyer, who started asking for a full accounting, who gained marital property rights in North Carolina the day the marriage held, and who could ask a court to divide the estate fairly if it ever came apart, was a threat to all three of them at once. Margaret feared losing the family. Claire needed the trust drained before anyone looked too closely. Lawrence needed no one to ever audit his work. I had married into a house rotting behind the paint, and my arrival had set a clock ticking that they could only stop by making me disappear cleanly, with paperwork, before I noticed the rot. The drugging suddenly made a horrible kind of sense. Make the bride collapse, file the pre-drafted annulment, void the marriage and my rights along with it, and the rot stays hidden for one more year. 3 people, 3 motives, 1 folder. I had thought I was fighting a snob. I was fighting a scheme. And schemes, unlike snobs, leave records. I want to stop here for 1 second, because this is the part of the story where I had to make a real choice. I could have leaked all of it, the debt, the hollow trust, the lie about my drinking, and burned the whole family to the ground in a week of phone calls. I didn't. I gave it to my lawyer and the sheriff and let the daylight do the work. If you have ever been tempted to fight dirty against people who fought dirty first, and chose the harder, cleaner road instead, you know exactly how this feels. Hit subscribe, and let's finish it. There was one evening, before any of it broke open, when I almost felt sorry for her. Elliot had gone to the house to tell his mother that he had seen the dates and wasn't signing anything. I waited in the car. He came back an hour later and sat behind the wheel without starting it. He told me what she had said. She hadn't denied it. She had done something worse. She had explained it. She told him about his father's first marriage, the one before her, the wife who had charmed the old man and then, over a decade, bled the Hartwell estate down to 1/3 of what it had been. Lawyer by lawyer, account by account, smiling the whole time. Margaret had watched it happen as a young woman engaged to the family's son. She had watched those columns go up on a house that was already hollow. And she swore she would never let it happen again. She said the second she met you, a nurse, no money, marrying up, she knew, Elliot told me, staring through the windshield. She said she did what no one had the spine to do the first time. I sat with that. I won't pretend it didn't move something in me. She wasn't a cartoon. She was a frightened woman who had built her entire identity around guarding a legacy that was already gone, who had looked at me and seen a ghost from 40 years ago, and who had decided that fear gave her the right to poison a stranger at a party. Understanding her was not the same as forgiving her. A reason is not a permission. I felt the pity. I let it pass through me. And then I picked the report back up. Fear explains a great deal. It excuses nothing. Elliot made his choice in actions, not speeches, which is how I knew it was real. The morning after that conversation in the car, he called the bank and began the work of separating his life from the trust his mother controlled. It was harder than it should have been. His accounts had been tangled with the family's in ways Lawrence had designed to be difficult to unwind. But he started. He moved his direct deposit. He opened an account in just our 2 names. He resigned in writing from a small advisory role on the trust that Lawrence had given him years ago precisely to keep him inside the circle. Each step cost him something. He had grown up believing the trust was his father in some way, that loyalty to it was the only thing his father had ever really asked of him. Pulling free felt, to him, like leaving a grave. He did it anyway. One night he said the thing that told me he had crossed over for good. I keep waiting to feel like I'm betraying her, he said. And instead, I just feel like I finally stopped letting her betray you." Then he said he wanted to be in the room. Joan and the sheriff's investigator had been building toward a formal sit-down, a meeting the family did not yet understand the shape of. Lawrence and Margaret were trying to call their own gathering, a trust review, where they planned to confront me, present the unstable bride narrative, and produce the annulment papers for Elliot to consider. They thought they were summoning me to my own quiet end. We let them think it. And Elliot asked one thing. "Whatever you bring into that room," he said, "let me be standing next to you when you set it down." The meeting was called for a Sunday afternoon at the Hartwell house, in the formal front room with the general's portrait and the long mahogany table. Lawrence called it a family trust review. The invitation, relayed through Elliot, made the agenda clear without saying it outright. They wanted Elliot and me both present. They wanted Margaret, recovered now, to speak about her concerns for the family's well-being. They wanted Lawrence there to walk everyone through some documents. It was the staging of an intervention, with me as the patient and the annulment as the cure. I knew exactly what folder would be on that table. So Joan and I prepared a different one. We had the sealed flute photographed and formally logged. We had the forensic report. We had the post-nuptial agreement and the annulment petition with their impossible dates. We had signed statements from the banquet manager, the bartender, and the cousin. And we had one more guest the family did not know was coming. I spent that whole week calm, the strange, flat calm I get before a long shift I know will be brutal. I laid my clothes out the night before. I read the report one final time, not because I needed to, but the way you check your kit before a code. Elliot asked if I was nervous. I told him the truth. I've stood at the foot of a lot of beds and told a lot of families the thing they didn't want to hear, I said. I know how to keep my voice steady while the room falls apart. He reached across the table and took my hand. The trap they had built had one flaw they never considered. They had assumed the quiet one in the family was the one who would break. They were about to find out she was the one who had been writing everything down. We arrived at the Hartwell house at 2 on Sunday, and the front room was arranged like a stage. Margaret sat at the head of the mahogany table, restored to her full self, pearls on, a cup of tea she didn't touch. Lawrence sat at her right with his manila folder squared in front of him. Claire sat at her left, pale, her fingers worrying the hem of her sleeve. There were others too, the aunt who had made the worried phone call, a family cousin, the minister who had married US and whom Margaret had invited to lend the afternoon a certain gravity. Elliot and I were shown to 2 chairs at the far end of the table. The petitioner's end. The children's end. I noticed the seating and almost smiled. Some habits never die. I set my own folder on the table in front of me, plain, unremarkable, and folded my hands on top of it. 2 other people had come with us that day, and the room had no idea they were waiting in the front hall. One was Joan Albright, my attorney. The other was investigator Dana Wells from the county sheriff's office, who had spent 3 weeks quietly verifying everything in my folder and who had asked, with great interest, to be present when the Hartwell family reviewed their documents. I had not told the room they were there. I wanted Margaret to begin. I wanted her to lay her plan on the table with her own hands, in front of the minister she had brought to bless it, before she learned that the daughter-in-law she had tried to erase had brought the law into her own front room. Margaret cleared her throat and the room went quiet for her the way it always did. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "We need to talk about Sara. She was good. I will give her that, to the end." She spoke softly, more in sorrow than in anger, the loving matriarch forced to address a painful family matter. She talked about how worried she had been since the wedding. She gently referenced her own spell that day and let the implication settle, that something about the bride, about the strain the bride had brought, had unsettled the whole event. She spoke about changes she had noticed in me. Moods. Concerns about drinking she had hoped were nothing. The aunt nodded along, primed by 3 weeks of careful phone calls. Then Margaret turned to Lawrence. "Lawrence has looked into some protections for the family," she said. and for Elliot. We think it's only prudent. Lawrence opened his folder with practice gravity and slid 2 documents toward the center of the table. The postnuptial agreement. The annulment petition. These are difficult to discuss, he said smoothly. But given the circumstances, the family feels Elliot should consider whether this marriage was entered into in good faith. There's no shame in correcting a mistake early. He looked at Elliot with rehearsed sympathy. Son, no one is forcing anything. We just want you to have options. It was beautifully constructed. The trap sprung gently, with tea and a minister and a folder of options. They waited for me to cry, or shout, or beg. To perform the instability they had been advertising for weeks. I did none of it. I sat at the foot of that table with my hands folded on my plain folder and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone except me. Then I looked at Lawrence, and then at Margaret, and I said the only thing that room was not ready for. Before anyone signs anything, I said, I think you should know what was in the glass. I opened my folder and began, not loudly, just clearly, one item at a time, the way I give report at the end of a shift. On the night of the wedding, I said, before the toast, Margaret stood at the bar and tied a gold ribbon on one of the 2 champagne flutes. The bartender remembers. The banquet manager remembers. I slid their signed statements to the center of the table, beside Lawrence's documents. Then she added 3 drops from a glass vial into the ribboned flute. I saw her do it in the reflection of the copper backsplash behind the bar. I set down a photograph of the sealed flute in its evidence bag, the gold ribbon visible, the date and time written in my handwriting on the label. I didn't drink from that glass. I switched ours, and she drank it herself, which is why she couldn't stand at her own son's reception. I placed the forensic report on the table and turned it so Margaret could read the bold line at the top. This is what was in it. A sedative, at a dose meant to put a woman my size on the floor. Not to kill me. To humiliate me. To make me look exactly the way you've spent 3 weeks telling everyone I am. The aunt's hand had risen slowly to her mouth. The minister had gone very still. I reached for the final pages. And these, I said, touching the postnuptial agreement and the annulment petition that Lawrence had just laid down so proudly, are dated. This one, 11 days before the wedding. This one, 9 days before. You drafted the papers to end my marriage before I was even married. The drug was the cue to file them. I looked around the silent table and offered the one line I had been saving, the one that held the whole afternoon together. Don't drink what they pour you, I said quietly. You'll always want to know what's in it first. Margaret broke first, and she broke loudly. How dare you, she said, rising from her chair, her voice climbing to a pitch the family had never heard. How dare you bring this into my home, into your father's house? She was no longer talking to me. She was talking to the room, to the aunt, to the minister, trying to wrench the audience back to her. She switched the glasses. She's admitting it. She drugged me. Joan Albright chose that moment to step in from the hallway. She switched 2 glasses your client had already tampered with, Joan said calmly. Drinking your own poison is not a crime committed against you. Behind her came Investigator Wells in a plain jacket with a badge clipped at her belt, and the room changed temperature instantly. Claire made a small, strangled sound and turned on her mother. I told you this was insane, she hissed. I told you the papers were too much. I never agreed to she stopped. But it was too late. The agreement was in the air now. Lawrence was already gathering his documents with shaking hands, saying he would need to consult his own counsel, that he had been acting on information provided by his client, that he could not be held responsible. The 3 of them turned on each other in the space of a single minute, each one reaching for the lifeboat, each one shoving the others away. Margaret stood at the head of the table she had ruled for 40 years and watched her allies scatter. Her face did the thing I had first seen at the rehearsal dinner. The smile gone. The flatness exposed for what it had always been. Through all of it, I stayed in my chair at the foot of the table, hands folded, saying nothing. Because there was nothing left for me to say. The paper said it for me. In the middle of all that noise, Elliot stood up. He didn't shout. He walked the full length of the table, past his mother, past Lawrence and his trembling folder, past his sister, and stopped beside my chair. He put his hand on my shoulder where the whole room could see it. "I've heard enough," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried, because everyone had gone silent to hear which way the sun would fall. "You drafted papers to throw my wife out before I married her," he said, looking at his mother. "You put a drug in her glass at our wedding, and you brought a minister here today to help you do it cleanly." Margaret reached for him, the old reach, the one that had always worked. "Elliot, everything I did to protect this family." "She's not a threat to this family," he said. "She is my family." Then he looked at her for a long moment, and he gave her back the words she had aimed at me twice, once at the rehearsal dinner, and once over my poisoned glass. In his mouth, they finally meant something true. "To family," he said. "The real kind." He helped me up from the petitioner's chair at the foot of the table, and we walked out of the front room together, past Investigator Wells, who gave me a small nod, past the general's portrait, out into the bright June afternoon. Behind us, the house full of old money that wasn't really there anymore had finally, completely gone quiet. I'll tell you what happened to all of them, because I know you want to know. And because the daylight I chose did exactly what daylight does. Investigator Wells took my folder, the flute, and the report into a formal case. These things move slower than television promises. It was nearly 4 months before a grand jury heard it. Proving intent had been the central question, and the documents dated before the wedding answered it directly. That fall, Margaret was charged with a felony, the kind that carries real years, because spiking a drink with a sedative is not a prank, and the law does not treat it like one, especially when the annulment papers are sitting in a drawer with the dates still on them. She was arraigned in the same county where she had hosted 40 years of charity fundraisers. She did not go to jail that day. The system moves slowly, but the case is moving, and her own attorney told her there is no version of this where the dates disappear. Lawrence Finch's role unraveled on its own track. The moment Joan filed for a full trust accounting that summer, the rot came up like a pulled floorboard, and it kept coming for the better part of a year. The state bar opened an inquiry into a man who had served as both trustee and attorney while quietly billing an estate into a shell. The trust was frozen pending an independent audit, and the early numbers pointed to years of self-dealing that had nothing to do with me. Claire's debt became the least of her problems once her name surfaced in the timeline of the scheme. She is cooperating now, which is a polite word for telling the truth about her mother in exchange for not being charged alongside her. The Hartwell estate, the columns, the country club, the legacy Margaret had been willing to poison a stranger to protect, had been hollow for years. She had guarded a ghost. As for Elliot and me, we did the one thing that mattered most, and it wasn't dramatic. We drew a line and we held it. No contact. Everything through Joan. We sold nothing of theirs, took nothing of theirs, and asked for nothing but to be left alone, which, after everything, felt like the richest thing we owned. Elliot finished untangling his accounts from the trust, and we started over on a nurse's salary and his smaller, cleaner, entirely ours. I went back to my unit, to the 4 a.m. coffee and the families in the worst hour of their lives, and I was better at it somehow for having sat at the foot of that mahogany table and stayed calm. People ask me if I wish I had just thrown the glass away that night and never known. I don't. Because the truth, once I had it on paper, didn't make me bitter. It made me free. I stopped being a guest in a family that wanted me gone, and I became a woman who knew exactly where she stood. If there is one thing I learned at the foot of that table, it is this: the people who decide you don't belong are almost always the ones most afraid of what they would lose if you did. And staying calm isn't weakness. It's the steadiest hand in the room. That's my story. 1 glass, 3 drops, and a family that mistook quiet for harmless. If this reminded you to trust that small, cold feeling in your gut, or to keep the proof, the message, the dated page, take that as your sign and act on it today. And if someone you love is being made to feel like staff in their own family, share this with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.